English since the late 19th century. You think it's hard being an Asian American writer now? Imagine being an Asian American writer in the late 19th century. It's like, oh my God, who is this person writing in English with an Asian face? But it was because for over a century, Asian Americans had been organizing, advocating for equality, trying to change institutions, publishing, that they've done all that someone like me and people like us could come along, even though we were a different kind of Asian American as Vietnamese Americans, nevertheless, we had an entree. I mean, at least there was some recognition that there was such a thing as Asian American lit. Now, there was no recognition that there was Vietnamese American lit, wasn't that, that's all we had to prove, right? But now we proved it. Now we proved it. And now, in fact, Vietnamese American lit is like super hot. Oh my God, there's like so many Vietnamese American writers out there. I host a show called Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, and there's like so many new writers we have come on board and we talk about their works. It's really incredible. Because back in the day, a book by a Vietnamese American would come out every few years or a decade, and we'd all freak out, like, oh my God, another book by a Vietnamese American. I was like, oh, I can't keep up. So, but that's part of the organizing work, right, that you don't get to see. And so one last thing about this, I think we talk about water and milk as a metaphor, and I think about my friend Jeff Chang, the cultural critic. He wrote a book called Who We Be, A Cultural History of Race in Post-Civil Rights America. Number two, we are constantly looking for stories to tell, which means we're looking for the juicy stuff, the secrets, the trauma, all the stuff that most families don't want to have talked about in public, especially Vietnamese families, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure you've heard people say, don't talk about this, whatever it is. Now, with writers, however, that's what we talk about. Most Vietnamese American literature, as far as I can tell, is about trauma of one kind or another. And so part of the dilemma here is that we've been talking about creators by the nation and by the community because they do things that the community doesn't like. And so it's also highly gendered. It's one thing for me to betray secrets, but I'm a man. For a woman to betray secrets, it's actually much worse, right? And then for community organizations, you're supposed to represent the community, but what happens when you do things that the community doesn't like? I know that Lan, again, you were in Bala, was involved, for example, in the art exhibit Fog 2 some years ago. And that was Vietnamese and Vietnamese American art, and guess what? The Vietnamese community protested that, okay, which we can get into. But I want to get into that dynamic, you know, the ethical, personal, artistic, organizational dilemma and dynamic of wanting to talk about the communities and the families' truths and experiences and how powerful that is, but also how potentially dangerous that is if people feel that you're betraying them, whether it's a family or a friend or a lover or the community itself. Isabelle, we'll start with you.
Too long, because I can go forever on this topic. Well, I just want to start with the story. Well, you know, now I just say, you know, I gave up this idea of writing because I just want to use my time to support other writers. But for a long time, I wanted to write about my mother. And my mother, you know, I remember her telling me, say, "Oh, I don't give you permission. I don't give you my signature to write about my story." I said, "Mom, I don't need your signature." So she said, "Well, in that case, just say this, this, and that, and then everything else you remember wrong." Here's a real memory. And she even wrote an essay, you know, a little book for me to you know, and it's called the Vietnamese Cinderella. So that's what the story she wanted me to tell. And then as I wrote, you know, I don't remember the way she sees herself as a Vietnamese Cinderella doesn't coincide with my memory at all. But this was an important story for her to hold on to. So yes, well, just also another story is, you know, when you speak about a woman as, you know, having, you know, there's a lot of weight on a woman, a lot of pressure not to tell. Right? I think, you know, and Lan in her book, Women Make Up Plans made clear, right, that men get away more than women, right? That's just a bit. For the audience specifically. Yes. The Asian American, Vietnamese American writers, right, they have to deal with one, the pressure to write a story on their own terms, right? They want to write about the war, it's fine, not write about something not about the war, right? It's not a given because it may not be published if you don't write certain stories. So this is one, right? Then you have the pressure from also the inside. Can I tell? Do I have the entitlement to tell my story? Who am I? Right? So how you situate yourself in society, right? I mean, I dealt with that. I say, who am I to tell stories? It's a very strong barrier. And for women, non-binary, queer, yes, especially, we talk about trauma, and this is, I remember, doing research on Vietnamese American women, and it was a lot of domestic violence in the communities, in the 80s and 90s, and you're not supposed to write about this because the pressure is, communities or the vulnerable, the racism is very difficult. You want to look good and to have the daughters say, speak what happened in a family just makes, feel like, oh, we don't want that. We don't want, make us look bad, right? So, but in order to break the cycle, you have, and if you're a creator, if you're creative, you have this need to tell. So it's a woman in a very, and queer people, a very difficult place to be a writer. This is in a poet. It's even harder, I will argue. Actually, I should want to say, Lan and Viet and I just co-edited this new apology of called Legal Writers, Vietnamese Diaspora in Dialogue, when we had 30 writers paired together around the world telling what's important to you, what matters to you. And it's very clear, it's like 2023, right, for women and queer, this issue was very central to, it's like, how do we tell, fulfill a creative needs and wanting to tell in order to break the cycles of violence with the weight of feeling that we betray families and sometimes lose families, right? Because we may be rejected. It's very, very difficult. So that's why, actually, make a pitch right now. We do it in order to, in recognition to this, right? For DVAN right now, we have residencies in New York, inviting women only, right, to come together, for 2 weeks to support each other, like internally, right, to give each other the strength, because as a group to say what we want to say, and that is so important for them, internally, but for the community as well. This is it takes courage, but it's very difficult.
When it was actually a Mao or infant blood years ago. And this is a story about joy and not necessarily trauma. But that is how Viet and I met almost 30 years ago. It was at an infant blood poetry reading. So it was at that moment when I realized I had a community and I was being heard and seen. So it's very important to have those infrastructures in place. And 30 years later, we're still together, and love happens. That's what I'm
Love
saying.
happens at poetry readings. That's your romantic partner there.
So yes, a story of love and joy, which is not what you'll find in this book. But brought up the question of how women write, how queer folks write, because it's often out of a place of fear and shame, because we're not conforming to certain expectations and ideals of how we should act according to society. And I would say that being a Vietnamese daughter, refugee, daughter of Vietnamese refugees has made it even more important that I tell our stories, that I tell the history behind my father in the South Vietnamese Army, and tell the stories about how we were highly impacted by the war to this day, and that intergenerational trauma is alive and living with us. But to have to be able to get to that moment, to this place where I can talk about trauma, this book is 25 years in the making, is to be able to reconcile who my family is, my father is, versus the person of the people and being able to embrace the fact that even though these are secrets, that are dirty stories that can come out of this family space, it is still important for me to tell all, because we don't, I didn't see any of these kinds of stories growing up that we talked about. And to this day, we don't have enough stories or narratives about those who were impacted by the war, and first generation from our elders, who I want to honor their memories of the war and the experiences, but then also those like myself, 1.5 generation, those who came to the U.S. early, have very little sense of what has just happened in terms of the war, and still trying to piece together what that meant. So all of this is to say that it was a difficult journey and process, but it was so important for me to bring together this idea to archive our own stories, not only the communities, but also my families, and make sure that this is a documentation that can speak to other people, mostly young women like myself.